Welcome. My name is Roy Nascimento, and I am the president of the North Central Massachusetts Chamber of Commerce, one of the organizations involved in the Elect North Central Coalition. On behalf of Elect North Central, I'd like to welcome you to our third in a series of gubernatorial forums, tonight with Republican candidate Geoff Diehl. Elect North Central is a coalition of organizations in North Central Massachusetts that are dedicated to making the democratic process accessible and assuring that the unique needs of North Central Massachusetts are understood by those seeking to represent our communities. We are committed to bringing this type of forum and discussion to the region. I'd like to introduce our host, Kevin Cormier. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Roy, and thank you, Geoff Diehl, for joining us here on Elect North Central and our gubernatorial forums here at the Workers Credit Union studio at FATV.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate you having me. And Roy, thank you very much as well.
Great. So we'll start off just by you introducing yourself to the voters, telling them a little bit about yourself and why you're running for governor.
Should I look into a camera, or do you want me to tell you who I am?
Tell me, or you can look into the camera that's in
I'll
red.
Look at this
that
one.
would be yours.
Great. Well, thanks, Kevin. For folks who don't know who I am, I served in the legislature from 2010 to 2018 as a state representative from the town of Whitman, representing Abington and East Bridgewater as well. My wife and I live in the town of Whitman. We have two daughters, Kaylee and Emily. Kaylee's in college right now. Emily is in high school. They're both going to be juniors this year. Emily, my youngest, just became class president, so that's exciting news in the household. But we have a great life in the South Shore, and so for us, I ran for state legislature in 2010 because I was serving on the finance committee in the town of Whitman, and I just felt like the state representative that we had, who was vice chair of education, wasn't necessarily looking out for the best interest of the district, and specifically the town I lived in, the Whitman-Hanson Regional High School. I was the liaison to the school board, and so I ended up running for office at 40 years old, never running for office before in my life, never being involved in politics before in my life, but it was something that I just felt passionate about because I thought Beacon Hill wasn't necessarily listening to the people of the state. And it wasn't just the funding for my schools, it was also the fact that as a small business owner, plus I worked for a manufacturing company that did signage, and the business that we own, my wife runs. It's a performing arts school, so my wife teaches dance, acting, and voice. We had met in New York City on a blind date. She was a Broadway performer, so we gave her career a shot out in LA, and we moved back to Massachusetts when she was ready to open up her own studio. We had two children, and we raised them near her family, so it's a perfect arrangement for raising a family. But again, I just felt that the state at the time, in 2008, 2009, we were trying to recover from that economic collapse with the housing market and the financial collapse. So Beacon Hill was sort of doing things that I felt were out of step with what we really needed for the recovery at the time. And ironically, now we're coming out of a pandemic, and once again, I sort of feel the calling to get involved. And after 2018, when I finished up my career on Beacon Hill, I also ran against Elizabeth Warren for U.S. Senate. And so that was a chance. What I was hoping to do in that race was really work on issues that were important to Massachusetts. And from D.C., I felt that, unfortunately, Elizabeth Warren was more focused on herself and really partisan politics down in Washington that really wasn't working for our state. So that was the case I was trying to make in 2018. I wasn't successful, but I did receive almost 1 million votes and built a great network of people that I met across the state during that run in 2018. So I felt the calling again after the pandemic to try to bring what I know about state government combined with what I know about the private sector and try to get to the corner office now in 2022 as governor and make sure that our state gets back on track fiscally and with policy that works for everybody, whether it's healthcare, education, transportation. There's so many things that our state certainly needs to do to, I think, improve in some ways. In some places where we do absolutely incredible job, but it's a making sure that we continue to have that balance, that everybody has a chance in Massachusetts. So I'm looking forward to that opportunity, and of course looking forward to having a discussion about that tonight.
That's great. And you ticked off a number of issues that hopefully we can take a little deeper dive into over the next hour and get to know Geoff Diehl a little bit better as you continue your campaign for governor. So your daughter won the class presidency. So you'll be following. You're looking to follow in her footsteps now, right?
We did not want her to run too. It's one of those. Come on, in an election year, I don't want her to feel any extra pressure with my campaign going on. But she ran and she did a fantastic job.
But now you got to keep up. So you're feeling the pressure.
Exactly. She's going to show up the old man.
Very good. So our first question: compared to Boston, North Central Massachusetts, and the three main cities, Fitchburg, Leominster, Gardner. have not achieved their full economic potential as a region. How would your administration utilize resources to spur investment in our region?
You know, infrastructure is important. I know Fitchburg has recently been able to upgrade the bridge nearby, but you've got the State College that's nearby as well, which obviously creates sort of a hub where you can do a lot of career alignment to make sure that any new businesses we bring to Massachusetts, we can get those students to try to match up with the jobs that are being offered in those new careers. You know, one of the things that we're seeing as the world changes, really, you know, is that automation, warehouse work is something that is taking over in a lot of parts of our state. And automation on the warehouse floor, you know, you're going to have a lot of robotics that are involved, a lot of, you know, new push towards electric cars. There's going to be different industries popping up based on changing times in manufacturing. I think what we have to do is make sure that, because only 25% of our students go on to four-year colleges, a lot of them go right out of high school into a vocation. We need to make sure that the workforce alignment in certain regions matches up with what the economy needs. And we need to have a governor that's going to go out there and try to bring businesses back. I know out in Springfield we lost Smith & Wesson. Politics kind of decided their reason to leave. I mean, 60% of what they make is going to be banned in Massachusetts based on Maura Healey's feelings about the Second Amendment. The other thing is Raytheon is leaving, their headquarters are leaving as well. I live on the South Shore. We have similar problems to this region as well. We don't get the same investments that Boston gets, and it's great that our capital city gets tons of money for transportation. I'll have to say, back in 2014, when I led the repeal of the index, we were going to stop the gas tax from going up automatically every year without a vote. In 2013, Deval Patrick set that in motion, and the legislature enacted it, and we had to repeal that because we knew that, you know, tying your gas tax to inflation could be a disastrous formula. And sure enough, right now, with inflation being potentially over 10%, you know, it's unreported inflation, I think, is beyond 10%. If you tied your gas tax to that right now, our cost per gallon would be astronomical compared to maybe even California. So the point was, at the time, we felt that transportation dollars were already being allocated incorrectly, and you know, areas like the central Massachusetts area, western Massachusetts, were paying a lot of in the gas tax that was being utilized by the MBTA, and a lot of that money was being wasted. So, you know, I think that what we have to do is make sure that, yes, Boston's going to need what it takes to keep that city going. It's a great tourist area. It's a great innovator for where our colleges are based around. It's a great place where a lot of technology, the health sciences are there. But we've got a lot of agriculture. We've got a lot of, you know, manufacturing infrastructure that truthfully needs to be picked up again and used again. So there's a lot of places. I think the East-West Rail is a way to link up across the state to make sure that people can actually move out to more affordable areas, and that could be another area where we build more affordable housing in the region to help people as well. So I think there's a ton of work, and living outside in a southern suburb of Boston, I absolutely know what it is to kind of feel like you're being snubbed by the capital city. And I'll add this one last thing. Right now there's currently an initiative by the governor to create smart housing development along rail lines. Okay, that makes sense. Put affordable housing units, multi-family housing units right near where people don't necessarily need to have a car, so they can get in a train and go to and from work. The problem is, in a town like Hanson, where I live in the South Shore, we live in Whitman, but our business is in Hanson, there's no sidewalks, there's no public transportation. So if you put that smart housing there, there's really no good way for somebody then to live affordably without a vehicle and get to and from the supermarket or the services they need. So Beacon Hill, right now, by the way, is awash in a lot of extra cash, unanticipated tax revenue, almost $3 billion. They could take a lot of that money and help flesh out the infrastructure that's needed in the suburban areas and in central and western Massachusetts to allow better mobility for people as we try to push more affordable housing across the state.
You had touched on inflation, and that's certainly something that is being felt very painfully in the pockets of people in our state and across the country. We're facing the highest inflation in 40 years. What can the state do, if anything, to help residents and the families of North Central Massachusetts combat the high prices of food and gas and other commodities?
Well, I hate to say it, unfortunately, a lot of the monetary policy out of Washington, D.C. is driving this. Printing more dollars reduces the value of the dollar. The supply chain issues that we're seeing, the decision by President Biden to cut off competitive energy supply has sort of forced our hands with having to look now elsewhere for a higher cost fuel. And so a lot of that's translating into the inflation that we're seeing. And what I think the state can and should be doing is preparing for the next few years when the pandemic money that's been allocated to Massachusetts starts to dry up. We're going to have to basically make do with what the state can generate from its own tax base. And right now, again, like I said just a minute or two ago, we have collected billions of dollars in unanticipated tax revenue. We should be putting that as much away in the rainy day fund as possible. But one thing I got to tell you, it's really an insult, is, and as a small business owner, I just felt this was the wrong thing to do. The pandemic, as I think everybody knows, government forced businesses to close. Now, it was sort of a hand-picked businesses to close. Most mom and pops closed. Targets, the big stores, they got to stay open, right? But those mom and pops were closed. Now they're not bringing in revenue. They still have to pay their mortgages if they have a property. They're paying a lot. Now there was relief money that came in, PPP loans and things like that, but not necessarily what you need to keep your business going. When we were lucky enough to reopen, you know, there was a lot of people that were still incentivized not to go back to work with enhanced unemployment benefits. So it was hard for businesses to, when they wanted to reopen, even get the workforce they need. To this day, we're still dealing with reduced workforce availability right now. So now those businesses are being saddled with a new unemployment cost that the legislature just borrowed against. 20 years, they borrowed almost $7 billion in unemployment costs as a reimbursement to the federal government. And here's the thing, the federal government just gave us close to $5 billion in pandemic revenue relief money. What the state legislature, I argued, should have been doing was taking the bulk of that $5 billion and putting it into our unemployment trust fund so we didn't have to bond so much money against these businesses that still remain in Massachusetts.
But how does that translate to the average worker in Massachusetts, the average family in Massachusetts, that are really feeling the impact of high food prices, high gas prices? Is there something the state can do? I know we can't control what inflation is on a national level, but is there anything the state can do to help those families?
Well, like I said, Kevin, I think one of the problems is going to be that those businesses can't necessarily give people the raises that they would, you know, annual raises you like to be seeing. So that's one area where the businesses can't, they may even have to lay off people depending on what the costs are. And supply chain issues right now are already causing an increased cost in goods. I mean, if you're a restaurant owner, I know the price of roast beef has virtually doubled, you know, just in the last few months. If you're in transportation of any kind in Massachusetts, the cost of fuel. So businesses aren't going to be able to give the raises. But on the other side, you know, the state right now is going to be looking, I think, for the future to try to increase taxes on people. And they, in my opinion, should not be looking to increase revenue. I think they should be looking to make sure that they actually give people a break. One of the things they could do right now is to lift the state gas tax, much like the federal government's actually considering, and much like other states in neighboring us have considered as well. Give people some immediate relief at the pump. It's not a ton, but it's something. Again, people trying to get their kids to and from school or to and from sports or getting themselves to and from jobs. Not everybody can transition to a you know, hybrid or electric vehicle over the next several years. I mean, those are $50,000 vehicles right now.
I asked your primary opponent a couple weeks ago the same follow-up question when the question came up about suspending the gas tax. And what I asked him is, the fact is the gas tax is not paid at the pump by the consumer. The gas tax is paid by the wholesalers. It's paid for by those oil companies before it even gets to the gas station. If we suspend the gas tax, do you trust the oil companies to pass that savings along to the consumers, or
That's a great question.
How would you force that to happen when the consumers see the savings?
Yeah, you know, I've actually talked to, there's a gas station owner right down the street from where my wife's studio is, and a lot of these guys that own the independent gas stations, they are really upset with the high cost of gas. They want to rebate as much as they can back to the consumer, because what's happening is people are trying to save so much they're not driving very much. Nobody's taking their vehicles in for repairs. Most of these gas stations, they don't really make a lot of money on the fuel. It's either the convenience store that's there or the services they provide for vehicle maintenance on top of that, where they can make some of a better margin. So the gas is really the lost leader to get them in. I do trust that businesses, gas stations, want to keep that gas cost as low as possible, because they want to get customers back in the door for other things they offer.
Okay. Our next question is going to come from Travis Condon, Public Affairs Manager for the North Central Massachusetts Chamber of Commerce. Travis.
Thank you for joining us today.
How you doing?
Good. As Massachusetts continues to rank among some of the least affordable states in the nation, what would you do to create and preserve housing opportunity for all if you're elected to be the next governor of Massachusetts?
Yeah, so I think, again, one of the things the current governor is doing, I think, is a great move. It's trying to put some housing development hubs right along public rail where we've got it in the state. One of the things we have to continue to do, though, I think, is look at expanding rail. South Coast Rail is one opportunity that still hasn't been finished yet. I think East-West Rail is still in its kind of infancy. And I've talked to MBTA workers who say that we also potentially should be expanding our rail lines up north. You know, when I met my wife in New York City on that blind date, neither of us owned a car, and we didn't have a car for about 4 or 5 years. We were able to take New York trains and buses all over the region, and I think Massachusetts, you know, still has some work to do. I mean, we've got MBTA cars that are still jumping the tracks right now, you know, new manufactured vehicles that don't even have the right wheel size to get on the tracks. That's not necessarily related to housing, but that's just something that transportation leads us to an ability to be in more affordable areas for continued development. Permitting process. The other thing too is, you know, to try to build some of these housing units, we have to make sure that we're going into towns, and towns are amenable to having those multifamily lower cost units available. You know, a lot of times you get that NIMBY, not in my backyard, by certain communities that don't want that in there. We have to make sure that all communities are willing to absorb the increased growth of Massachusetts. You know, we are a state of 7 million people. When I first became a state representative just 12 years ago, it was about 6.5 million people. So we're still growing at a really great pace, and we've got plenty of room across the state. I've been out to the Berkshires. You know, you see tremendous opportunities for growth out there. But one of the things we also need is infrastructure, not just transportation infrastructure, but wireless infrastructure, making sure that reliable communications, whether it's cellular or whether it's Wi-Fi, so that businesses could potentially relocate to central or western Massachusetts and have that reliable service, so that, again, people that don't want to be in the unaffordable Boston area anymore can actually have their companies and their workers in pockets of the state that have that reliable communications. In this modern day and age, if we don't have reliable wireless, it's really shame on us. We're one of the high-tech leaders in the world, Massachusetts is, so we need to deploy that more quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So you mentioned about restrictive zoning regulations and the NIMBY atmosphere. Now, the zoning ordinances are controlled by local city councils, select boards. You were a local official in Whitman, so you understand this. So if zoning regulations are under the purview of local cities and towns, would you as governor try to use some sort of heavy thumb on cities and towns to open up the zoning and reduce regulations?
It's funny, you know, look, there's the carrot and the stick, right, theory. Mm-hmm. I think the carrot is certainly something that a lot of people in state government are responsive to. If you can create incentives for towns to open up those areas, I think you can make it people very amenable to wanting to increase that. It's just finding the right thing. I can only give you some specific examples in the town I live in. We have some brownfield areas that if the state came in and were a partner in cleaning up some of that brownfield area, those would be perfect spots to build multifamily housing. So if we come in as a state and help them solve some of the local maybe issues they've got that could free up land to become developable, that would be great.
So expanding the brownfield tax credits, would that be something that you'd
That'd
be
be
looking
something,
for?
absolutely. You know, some of what we've got, part of the gas tax, goes to remediating underground oil tanks. You know, you drive through some of these towns, you'll see an old gas station that's kind of, the land is locked because they can never remediate that. Use that fund for what it's supposed to be used for. Make sure that we unlock some of that property all across our state that's been locked up due to underground oil issues.
Next question. What is your stance on the proposed fair share amendment ballot question, and do you believe that there is a need for tax reform in the Commonwealth?
So what that, if anybody who's watching doesn't understand, is that it's going to basically break open our tax code to allow, for the first time, an additional 4% on people that make over $1 million, okay? So it's a flawed formula to begin with, because a lot of businesses, my wife and I, our business that we own is an S Corp. Now, we don't bring in revenue close to $1 million, but you know, an LLC or an S Corp, theoretically, if the business is doing well, they may bring in excess revenue in excess of $1 million and by the way, that revenue is married up to your salary, right? So what ends up happening is if you have that over $1 million, now you're going to get an extra 4%. But the problem is that business may also have costs that bring that money back down. So people think that everybody's a millionaire who's going to be paying that 4% tax. Actually, small business owners, the mom and pops that invested their life savings and have an S corp or an LLC, they're now going to be zapped with an extra 4% because they're considered millionaires, even though their business may generate that revenue in association with their salary, but not necessarily what they ultimately take home every year, right? And so that's one flaw that I have with it. The other thing too is that I think right now, with the record tax revenue that we are showing that we have for several years now been collecting excess tax revenue. I think we have to be looking at anything but trying to raise taxes, especially with what I see facing us, which is that high inflation. And we basically, I think most economic experts agree, we're on the cusp of or are in the beginning of a recession. Raising taxes on anybody is going to cause people to leave the state. We had 50,000 people leave Massachusetts just last year alone. And I hate to say it, but a lot of those people, I think, are deciding that it's a very expensive state to live in. Housing costs are very high. The average cost of housing in Massachusetts is extremely high. And again, we're not cheap on a lot of the other services that we provide for people. Energy is a high cost. It's going to get higher based on our commitment to renewable energies. I have a problem with the fact that we won't keep all options on the table as far as liquid natural gas. We've shut Pilgrim Nuclear Power Plant 2 years ago or 3 years ago now. That was 19% of our state's energy. There is a lot of high cost to living in Massachusetts. Putting any new tax burden on anybody right now would cause flight, and usually people who have the capital like that, people who take that money and try to reinvest, we need them to stay in Massachusetts to build the businesses and the future jobs that we need to continue the growth pace that we're on. So I totally disagree with the ballot question, and I'm hoping it's defeated.
Our next question is from Matt Broom, who's the Director of Communication.
I should ask, I'm sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
And Matt, I apologize. I just want to add too.
Yes.
Part of the problem with that is that a couple of years ago they tried to get it on the ballot, and in the language it said, well, the money is going to be dedicated to education and transportation. Well, unfortunately or unfortunately, once new revenue is created, there is the legislature actually is unrestricted in where that money could be spent. So the courts ended up throwing that ballot question out 4 years ago because it was not constitutional. They've changed it so the language in the ballot question doesn't include that transportation and education anymore. However, the description that people are given when they go to vote says that it will be dedicated to education and transportation. It feels a lot like a bait and switch on the public as well.
But the legislature can spend it wherever they want.
They will ultimately spend it where they want to.
And that always ends well.
I served 8 years. It does not always go where you think it's going.
All right, so now we're going to go to Matt Broom, Director of Communication and Public Affairs at Fitchburg State University.
Hey, Matt.
Hi, Mr. Diehl, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
My question for you is about education. As governor, how would you ensure our K-12 schools are meeting the needs of the students and the communities they serve?
Boy, what a great question, because again, having 2 daughters who have gone through the public school system, K through 12, we think that it's a fantastic, Massachusetts ranks really top of the world, not just country, when it comes to education. And then our, postgraduate education, with the colleges that we have, it's fantastic. Fitchburg State, certainly not among the least. But I would say that, there's a couple things going on right now that are an issue. And some of it is the pandemic, of course, when we lost basically 2 years. 2020 sort of ended very badly. My daughter was a senior that year. The last portion of that year was just sort of erased. And the following year, the hybrid model really made it very difficult for kids to get that quality education that we expect them to get. There was some silver linings. I think we learned that there is a way to maybe take advantage of remote learning. Let's say, for example, in areas, I'm going to use my local town again. We can't afford more language teachers than just Spanish right now. If we were able to pool in with a remote learning sort of course, maybe we could actually give some kids an opportunity to have things like French or what other languages they might want to get. So the pandemic actually gave us a little bit of a glimpse as to some possibilities that could enhance education overall. Generally speaking, the funding is always the big issue. you know, what it takes to pay teachers the adequate salaries they have, what it takes to make sure that, you know, the curriculum is meeting what the kids need, and then again making sure that the kids are aligned once they graduate with what they need. Because, you know, we have some great vocational schools. One of the biggest problems, I think you know too, Matt, is we don't have the capacity to put enough kids into those vocational schools, and so there's a waiting list for them. So I want to see the opportunity for kids, if they're not thinking of four-year colleges, to be able to get that vocational training in some way, shape, or form. Again, my wife and I own a performing arts school. You know, unless there was a college that, you know, had theater arts, you know, it'd be great if there was a vocational school that taught them production, so that, you know, a studio like this, you know, kids could be coming right into the workforce here. But I guess the bigger point is that, you know, if you don't go into the four-year college, you may go to the military, but most kids after, even in Massachusetts, do go into a vocation. I think we've got to make sure that those vocational schools increase their capacity. And you know what's happening too is you get some of the basic district schools, right? There's been some poaching, right? What happens is the vocational school originally offered the vocation, but now what they're doing is they're offering that core curriculum as well, and so they're pulling kids out of that district, and the district ends up losing that money, and in fact paying sometimes $4,000 or $5,000 more per student to the vocational school. As governor, I really want to take a look at our educational funding formula and stop the situation where we poach and create that unnecessary competition. We shouldn't be competing for the kids. We should just be saying, hey, here's our skill set, here's your skill set, and let the kids decide without it negatively impacting each district. Thank you.
The visitor and tourism industry was one of the hardest hit industries in Massachusetts during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is a priority industry here in north central Massachusetts that we have identified for growth. How would you as governor help the tourism sector recover from the pandemic and grow our market share?
It was very difficult, obviously, when planes were, for the most part, people weren't flying because of safety issues, and now you've got people driving less because of the cost of travel. I mean, how can travel and tourism not be affected? So again, talking about a robust rail system that people could get around in is just one aspect of that. You know, making sure, because this is a unique state. You know, you've got, in the summer, the beaches; in the winter, you've got the skiing, and you've just got everything in between. Kayaking, which I like to do. You were saying that you like to paddle a bit, right?
Tubing down the
Tubing.
Deerfield. Tubing down in Charlemont, yes.
Tubing, right? I mean, these are all fun things that can draw people, not just internationally. What's that? Eating?
Eating, yes.
Well, we've got great restaurants in Massachusetts as well, too. But, you know, we're not just talking about drawing people in internationally. I know we have the Encore Casino. We have world-class sports teams in Massachusetts that draw a lot of people in. But there are a lot of amenities, you know, zip lining in Deerfield, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that are all across our state that we should be drawing attention to so that people in neighboring states, Vermont, New Hampshire, coming up from Rhode Island, coming up from Connecticut, coming over from New York, bring people to Massachusetts to do a lot of what they like to do for fun. And I think, you know, there's just a lot of things that we can do with tourism that I'd like to see enhanced as well. It's just a matter of, at this point, prioritizing the budgets going forward. So, you know, I know that that's going to be important, and I think local chambers can be part of the determining where we can do a better job as a state of promoting some of those activities that go on in the state. I guess I should mention this. One of the things I think I really want to see as a keystone to being governor here in Massachusetts, my administration, is that I listen to the people that work for the state. I listen to the people that work across the state. So, you know, we've got problems at the MBTA. I think the guys on the shop floor in the Everett repair station, they know exactly what we need to make sure that those trains run well. Sometimes they're afraid to say what's right because if they raise their hand and do something, you know, somebody gets threatened with the job above them. I want to create an environment where if you're working for DCF, Department of Children and Families, you can question policy that's been in place for years and say, let's try something different. I want to make sure that those workers who know what we need as state agencies do their job, but I also want to make sure I listen to the businesses and the chambers that interface with those businesses to know that as governor, here's your return on investment. If we spend more money on promoting, let's say, you know, tourism advertising here's what we anticipate is the ROI. I'm all for that if we can really make sure that the dollars end up bringing in more revenue.
We may not have the beaches out here, but we have Game On, Great Wolf, Hollis Hills Farm.
I've been to Great Wolf numerous times. You don't have to tell
Shoalin
me.
Farms. We have Wachusett Brewery. There's a lot of things that can make North Central Massachusetts a
The
destination
Woosocks
point.
came from Pawtucket up to
They did come to Worcester.
Massachusetts. So again, we are on the move in the right direction.
We are. For our next question, we're going to bring back up Roy Nascimento, President and CEO of the North Central Massachusetts Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Roy.
So my question, with the increase in early retirements and exits from the workforce brought on by the pandemic and the Great Resignation, businesses in North Central Massachusetts are facing an extremely tight labor
I
market.
haven't heard the Great Resignation. You should copyright that. That's not in a good way, unfortunately. But yes, I understand what you're saying.
And our economy is feeling the effects. If elected, how would your administration work to ease this labor shortage?
So right off the bat, one of the things I disagreed with was with the governor is the pandemic requirement that you get the vaccine or else you lose your job. So we've had numerous state troopers. In fact, just recently, about a month or two ago, 12 more troopers lost their job, even though we know that the breakthroughs with the boosters aren't necessarily providing the protections that we thought. A lot of these state workers, whether it was troopers or other jobs, were public facing, meaning they were out there in the pandemic when there was no vaccine. Perhaps they developed a natural immunity, perhaps they just knew that they had underlying health conditions that weren't right for them, and yet they were forced out of a job. So not only did we lose people that were fired in state government workers, but we also lost people who retired early because they just said, enough, I don't want to go through this. So the state itself has a lot of positions to fill right now, and I know that in healthcare, nurses, UMass Memorial Hospital in Worcester fired 200 nurses because, again, they felt that they had been through the pandemic in the front line. My running mate, Leah Cole Allen, is a nurse who was fired. She was pregnant during the pandemic, came home every night to her other child, and was pregnant at the time. Then when she had her baby, she was nursing during the pandemic still, did not want the vaccine because she was concerned about the effects on the child, was let go of her job. She feels very passionate that nurses know their health care pretty well and should have been given an option other than just being fired. And so, we have a lot of ground to make up for people who left their jobs, either retired early, and like I said earlier, 50,000 people left Massachusetts. We've got to make sure that those people are back in the workforce. So on day one, my administration is going to rehire anybody who was fired because of the pandemic vaccine requirement, and we'll make sure that the policy going forward is that your healthcare choices should remain your healthcare choices. I know it was an unknown pandemic. We all took steps to try to mitigate the risk and all that. But again, I feel like it put a burden on people that had already been not suffering, people who had sacrificed a lot to serve during a very difficult time. So that's just one part of it. The other thing too, again, it gets back to affordability. If you're somebody that wants to retire, where do you go to downsize your home? Because once you sell your house at a nice high price, there is also a very expensive, smaller home to purchase. It may not be the best decision right now. And if you're a young couple that either is coming to Massachusetts or graduating college and you're thinking about leaving, but you want to stay, can you stay? Can you afford to stay? So again, getting back to housing, that's something that also plays a big part in keeping that Great Resignation from happening, or at least mitigating the damage of the Great Resignation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our local communities have been consistently requesting an increase in Chapter 90 funding. There's a former legislator, I'm sure you're very familiar with
So Chapter 90 is transportation road funding, making sure your towns have the monies to build pave the roads, build the sidewalks, do all the sort of infrastructure improvements you need to do.
And it's outside of the main budget also.
Correct.
It's a separate budget.
And it's not state construction or federal construction, it's at the discretion of the local town.
So as governor, what are your plans to fix roads in major need of repair across the region? As you know, Chapter 90 funding has been level funded year after year after year after year, and the roads and bridges continually get in a state of disrepair. People are screaming for road repairs out in North Central Massachusetts. As governor, what are you going to tell them you're going to do about it?
And I always find that's the most difficult to explain, because the equity between what Boston gets for transportation dollars versus what the rest of the state gets, and yet most of the road traveled is outside the 495 Beltway, and they get sort of the shaft, if I can use a transportation term, I guess. But a lot of us people argue about the the Pike, right, Route 90, and why are we still paying a toll there, right, when it should be, that toll should have been retired? And of course the argument's always made, well, it needs to be kept in state of repair. That's the caveat that allows them to keep tolling it. And yet it's not always in the best state of repair itself. Generally speaking, what I believe in, and again, having served on the finance committee of my town, is that I want to make sure our cities and towns are taken care of first. I want to be a centrifuge of resources, capital resources, from Boston back out into the rest, from Beacon Hill, I shouldn't say Boston, from Beacon Hill, from the State House, back out into our communities. Let them make the decisions on what they need the most. Sometimes I think Beacon Hill tends to absorb a lot of those decision makings and the dollars that go with it, and don't necessarily provide the towns or trust the towns to spend it the way they should. Chapter 90 is one of those areas where I think absolutely you know exactly what, I'm not saying you per se, but you as a town would know exactly where that money is best spent for transportation upgrades.
But how would you increase that funding to cities and towns?
Well, I mean, again, part of it is making sure that of the tax revenue we bring in, a greater share is just allocated using the current funding formula.
Very good. Our next question from Sherman Whitman, morning host of WPKZ.
Hey, Sherman.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. People of color face a number of disparities in quality of life, including disproportionately high unemployment rates and more limited access to health care and high-quality education. As the next governor, how do you plan to address issues related to race and equity here in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I mean, you know, what I hope is that our state is, I feel like we've always tried to be a leader in making sure that we are blind to race, age, sex, when we try to provide the services, the opportunities for everybody in our state. In cases where we may not be matching that, delivering on that promise, you know, I'm certainly willing to listen to communities to make sure that we do a better job as a state. So I don't know, is there any specific area you were saying, you know, education, or I mean, for example, Boston Public Schools, I guess, to cite something right now, is on the verge of, and it just avoided going into receivership. And one of the things that I think in Boston that's been happening is that no matter how much money we're putting into Boston Public Schools, we're still not delivering the quality education for people, you know, minorities that are living in some of those communities. We have METCO. The METCO program was designed, you know, decades ago to try to give people of color a chance to go into suburban areas to get different opportunities. But it's really like a Band-Aid to the true problem, which is creating that permanent solution to equal education for everybody. So, you know, one of the things that you try to say is that in education, competition in the marketplace might be the way to help provide better quality for everybody. And I know that, you know, not everybody believes in charter schools, but even Deval Patrick and Charlie Baker have both seen fit to increase charter school capacity or opportunities so that people aren't locked in by a certain zip code to what their future education is going to be. I think that's something that we have to keep on the table for the future. Thank you.
In light of recent acts of mass violence across the country, how would you go about addressing public safety and school safety?
So school safety, I would have to say that one of the things that really feels like it's going in the wrong direction is this whole defund the police movement, and certain communities have already started taking school resource officers or DARE officers out of the schools themselves, physically out of the schools. I know in Whitman-Hanson we have a DARE officer that has an office actually in the school buildings, and I think that keeps them in close proximity to students in case of a situation with an emergency. But beyond that, you know, I think the other thing too is that we as a state have gun regulations, gun laws that really have allowed us to be a state that does not suffer from the same problems as other states. The tragedy in Texas, obviously, Sandy Hook. Those aren't in Massachusetts. Since Columbine, we've only had 2 school-related shootings, and I think only 2 deaths total because of those instances. And I'm not saying any death is acceptable, but our rate is probably the lowest in the country because what we have is, I think, sensible gun laws that already work. The background checks when you go to get your gun license, I think we in Massachusetts have safety in place to make sure that lawful gun owners are the ones who own the guns, and that anytime that somebody who shouldn't be getting the gun, that background check already makes sure that they don't get it. So I feel like we've got a lot of safeguards already in place. One of the things I think that has been spurred discussion has been mental health and making sure that we see the red flags along the way for people who are showing signs that they may have violent tendencies, and maybe that people have dropped the ball on catching those red flags with people in that case. And so to that sense, I'd like to make sure that mental health is something that we increase our awareness of and create funding of. And by the way, this kind of leads me into an additional thing, which is the opioid crisis, because I don't know if you know this, but in Massachusetts, we just had our record number of opioid deaths in our state, the highest number ever. So the pandemic put a lot of people who were in recovery back in a bad path, but also fentanyl coming into our neighborhoods, into our state, being trafficked in. What I want to see is our law enforcement do a better job, or not better job, being given the support and resources they need to try to stop that fentanyl trafficking that's coming through Massachusetts, because it's killing our kids at a higher rate than ever. And what is happening here is, of course, when it comes to opioid addiction, you want to make sure that you've got the mental health capacity to help them in recovery. The problem you'll see is a lot of that recovery is happening in centralized areas like Lawrence or in Boston or in Brockton. You know, the cities sort of become catch bins for people with opioid recovery needs, because that's where the services are provided. I think we have to, like I said way earlier in the show, get rid of that NIMBY attitude and push those recovery services back into the suburban communities where those people come from, because they need to own those addiction issues themselves. Keep those family members closer to home, closer to maybe the job that they had. I remember the discussion a couple years ago when Worcester was being created. They were making Worcester sort of the hub for mental health recovery, and the Cape was losing some of its facilities. And people on the Cape said, I really can't drive from the Cape to Worcester every day to see my son or my daughter or to see my husband or wife. It's very expensive, it's very difficult with my work schedule to try to be there for them. What I want to try to do is push recovery and mental health services back into our communities, so that, again, we have and again, if you have somebody in mental health crisis, where do they go? Generally speaking, they'll end up in an emergency room in sort of a mental health area, sedated for a couple hours and then sent back home or back on the streets, or they end up in a local lockup, either in the sheriff's jail or in a local holding area in their local police station, until they're either stable again, or they have recovered from either Narcan or whatever substance they're using. There's nothing in between. There is no minute clinic right now for mental health. Yes, you can go to a minute clinic and get a flu shot or get some sort of emergency treatment. There is nothing for mental health. We have got to increase the mental health capacity and incentivize people to come to Massachusetts, or incentivize young people to get into that career of helping with mental health. And I'll just end with this. I know I've kind of meandered a bit on this issue, but one of the things is, it is important. And one of the things that we did when I was a legislator was, there was a lot of discussion about how we didn't have healthcare doctors and dentists in Western Massachusetts, not enough to handle the population there. We incentivized doctors and dentists to relocate to Central and Western Massachusetts in exchange for either a partial payment or a total forgiveness of their student loans to become a doctor if they committed to a certain amount of time in parts of our state. I think we can do that. Incentivize people to get into the mental health field if they're willing to serve all across the state in a way that gives us that network of support that we need.
So I just want some clarity on one point. You said in that answer, at the beginning of the answer, that Massachusetts has not seen many gun deaths in schools, and gave credit to the gun safety regulations that are in place in Massachusetts. At the top of the show, when referencing Smith & Wesson leaving the state, you had mentioned Maura Healey and her views of the Second Amendment, and giving that as a reason why we're losing Smith & Wesson. So where do you feel Massachusetts gun laws are, safety regulations? Do we need less regulation, more regulation, or are we right where we need to be in terms of gun laws in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think we've sort of hit that sweet spot, like I said, where the lawful gun owner feels like we've got adequate protections in there to make sure that they can have the type of firearms they want to use, and at the same time, we're not dealing with high capacity magazines that cause the massive fatalities that we see elsewhere. And I think what we have also is law enforcement that's trained to be very responsive to handle emergency situations in a way that has been able to prevent tragedies as well. So a lot of these things go unsung. You never herald the thing that never happened, or but the good news is when we have such a low instance rate, I think it shows that we probably have figured out one of the better areas. All I'm mentioning about our Attorney General is that she decided that the AR-15 that Smith & Wesson manufactures, it's basically a look-alike gun. It is an Armalite. The design is an Armalite rifle. Everybody thinks AR means assault rifle. That is not what it means at all. It is a similar functioning as any other gun. One pull of a trigger shoots one bullet, right?
About 223.
It just looks like it's got a look-alike to a military-style gun, but it does not mean that it fires like a military-style gun. And yet she, decided that that was something that she felt was, should be banned. So that's a problem for them. They don't, if they can't manufacture that in Massachusetts, they're going to take a 100-plus-year-old industry out of our state. And we're seeing a lot of those gun manufacturers leaving New England states that are, that have that similar sort of attitude.
So is that something you would look to reverse?
I think what I want to do is just make sure that Second Amendment is protected where it is. And the Supreme Court actually just affirmed when it comes to LTCs, license to carry, that the Constitution actually already affirms your right to carry. And so we may actually end up dropping that suitability clause that gives each police chief in every town the ability to say that a person's not suitable. I think that's actually...
I think that directive just came out yesterday.
Exactly. So she initially... Maura Healey was initially against that Supreme Court decision, but ultimately had to issue that directive that says that the police chiefs can no longer be a unilateral decider of whether you should or shouldn't have your Second Amendment right to carry a gun.
Speaking of the Supreme Court, with the recent court decision to overturn Roe versus Wade, if you were to become next governor of the state, what would you do?
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is there's nothing to do at this point, because what's happened is that the Massachusetts legislature proactively passed the Roe Act to replace the national Roe v. Wade. All Roe v. Wade did was to, and by the way, Ruth Bader Ginsburg agrees with this. I think she initially made this case as well, is that it should never have been a decision that rested at the Supreme Court. It was always something that states should be decided. So it's now going, of course, state by state, and Massachusetts codified the Roe Act into law, I think over a year ago, or about a year ago. Governor Baker did veto a section of the Roe Act, which I agree with the veto, which was that a child that survives an abortion and in late-term abortion is not given, can be allowed to not get medical attention and die on the table. I just think that's way too extreme, and I think that that goes against, I think a lot of people actually felt that was not appropriate. It goes too far. So that's the one area I'd still like to see go back. I'm pro-life. I want to protect life where I can. But I understand that in this state, the legislature predominantly supports abortion, so that's where that decision is.
What if there is a red wave that the Massachusetts Republican Party is working on, and you get a legislature that is receptive to putting more restrictions on abortion? Would you be inclined to sign such legislation to have more restrictive abortion laws, or would you veto those?
Well, again, you're talking about a hypothetical that's hard to imagine right now. I mean, we have the Democrats have a supermajority in the House and the Senate, and the number is so overwhelming that it would take an incredibly strong red wave to even be able to have the discussion. I don't think the discussion is going to be happening for quite some time.
So the governor, though, I believe issued some executive orders after the Roe v. Wade decision, which would protect women coming to Massachusetts in terms of their privacy, going back to their home state, protecting executive orders, protecting medical service providers in this state, offering and providing services from those out of state. Would you leave those executive orders intact?
Well, I have to say again, I fall on the spectrum in the Republican Party of being a libertarian, and while I'm pro-life, I also feel that your healthcare decisions need to be your healthcare decisions. And people coming to our state for their own healthcare decisions, whatever they may be, that is up to them.
According to the Massachusetts Taxpayer Foundation, last year the Massachusetts economy lost $2.8 billion because working families can't afford the cost of child care. What will you do to expand child care access for those in need?
Well, we have a great candidate that's running not too far from here. Jeffrey Sosa Paquette is running for Congress. He runs child care centers and actually gave my running mate and I, Leah Cole Allen, a tour of some of his facilities there. Great place, and it's expensive because a working family, my wife and I know this personally. When our kids were young, we luckily had my mother-in-law and father-in-law right there to help out, but not everybody has those resources in place to be able to kind of cover for you when you need that help. So, where the state can, I think, make sure that the licensing is one of the things I think that Geoff Sosabek talked to me about was the cost of regulations for child care centers. And we want to make sure those centers are safe. We just want to make sure that you're not driving up the cost with government regulation on them to the point where they become so unaffordable. They're competing like everybody else just to try to provide a service or a product, and I think the more competition in the marketplace, the better. So I think I want to see more child care centers, of course, because I think that helps create that better quality. And at the same time, I want to make sure that the state does what it can to give those child care centers as much of a leg up, because those child care centers are allowing people to get to work and allowing Massachusetts to create growing and creating the tax revenue that we need to provide the services, and it's a circular thing. And so again, yes, I want to support child care and make sure that it becomes more affordable.
And I know earlier in the show we talked about the rising cost of energy and some of your ideas around that. With that in mind, the state has also codified into law some climate change goals.
Well, yeah. Yep.
So I'm wondering what would be your administration's strategy for balancing the state's climate change goals with the rising cost of energy?
Yeah, so again, the Attorney General is very proud about the lawsuits against oil companies, very proud against blocking LNG, increased capacity for LNG coming into the state. At the same time, we've lost nuclear power. We've lost coal-fired plants, and that's fine. I'm all for trying to get to a cleaner footprint. I'm all for moving towards renewables where we can. Part of the problem I see right now is that we're siting wind turbines into fishing grounds without any input from some of the fishermen with the scallop beds, the lobster beds. It's very difficult for them already because the climate change has affected the temperature of the water. The catch is moving around in different areas, and now they've got to compete with turbines that are in their fishing areas, right? You've got solar panels being sited, they're clear-cutting areas to put solar panels down. It almost feels like something out of the Lorax, the Dr. Seuss, where they cut down the trees. And to put solar panels in their place seems a little bit strange. We've got cranberry bogs where they're doing a test at UMass Dartmouth to see if the cranberry bogs can grow under a solar panel. I mean, you take the sun and put something in between it and the plant, it seems to me that would be a problem. And the problem to me, really the big problem, is an ecological problem, because those solar panels have to have also the battery power right next to them. When those solar panels over time break apart like anything else does, plastics break apart, the particulate falls into the ground. Those cranberry bogs, when they're harvested, a lot of times it's a wet harvest. The water's flooded in from a local pond or lake. The berries are knocked off the cranberry plants, and then the water's flooded back after it's harvested. If you've got anything in there that's foreign, that's these photovoltaic cells that break down, that could be a problem in the long term. So I think we have to stop the gold rush of renewables right now, because again, even if you put solar panels and wind farms everywhere you could, it's New England. We don't generate the same sun and wind power that other parts of the country do. So it's got its limitations. I think people admit that renewables can't produce all the energy we can.
So do you think the goals of zero renewable by, 2050?
Well,
I think it is, and then there's incremental goals in between there. Do you think those are achievable, and are you committed to those, or would you be looking to revisit those?
I'm committed to having a portfolio that includes all energy options, so that people who are trying to heat their homes in the winter aren't stuck basically having to chop down a tree to keep things warm for their house. However, I will say, and nobody's talking about this, and it really surprises the heck out of me, is that over in Devens right now, there's a company that's working on getting fusion nuclear energy perfected. Now, the past nuclear power that we've had goes back to the 70s, and this is not your mother's 3 Mile Island. This is not old nuclear technology. Fourth generation nuclear power now, they're actually trying to do fusion. Instead of splitting the atom, you bounce it together. You have to be able to harness basically the heat of the sun, so it's an incredibly difficult thing. But what I'm told by people who are in the investment field are saying that the plant that we have, or the development that's happening in Devens, they are actually on the cusp of being one of the first companies to harness fusion nuclear, which to me is one of the cleanest. It uses old spent fuel rods as part of its energy thing. Once it's going and up and running, it can produce a tremendous amount of power. I think what we're seeing over in Europe right now, I mean, I think Germany is really regretting the fact that they went away from nuclear and became dependent on Russian oil, which, by the way, I have to tell you, we took a whole freighter of Russian LNG not less than 2 years ago when we had we were lacking in LNG coming into our state. We had to take Russian LNG here. So if we don't want to fund the enemy, we got to figure out ways to do it right here in Massachusetts. The other thing, I think you and I were talking before we went on air, was that some of these farms, there's a farm specifically up in the Greenfield area that has what they call it a digester, but there's a more technical name to it. It actually takes animal waste like manure, and it takes food waste. You know, restaurants and grocery stores, when they get rid of their food, they put everything into this digester, and it's like a stomach in the ground. It's got these two bladders in it. It creates the methane gas that then feeds a turbine that produces energy. Okay, and they actually produce 10 times what they need to run their own farm. They're able to give back to their towns. Over in Europe, there's a lot of these digesters everywhere. They're expensive, but once they're up and running, they can really power a lot. So I think there's some unique ways that we have to be looking at to increase our overall energy capacity in ways that we never thought of before. So, and you know, again, I think a lot of auto manufacturers realize that we are going to get to fully electric vehicles maybe in the next 10 to 15 years. The problem too is that the mining of the lithium, there's some environmental impact to all that as well. So there's a balance not just here in Massachusetts but globally about how we can be good partners environmentally and still, you know, provide the energy we need to power.
So it sounds like taking a business approach to.
Yeah, you just have to,
climate change.
again, listen to the experts and make sure that we're keeping all options out there.
All right, so I'm going to ask you a loaded question and then give you only 3 minutes to answer. How's that?
We're getting close to the end, all right.
We are. It goes fast, doesn't it? So Congress has been unable to pass any meaningful immigration reform for years, effectively moving the issue to the states to deal with. If elected governor, how would your administration tackle some of these immigration issues that impact the economy, public safety, schools, and so much more?
You know, I always say everything the anger that arises from immigration all comes from basically one core problem, and that is that we are not processing people into our country fast enough. Over 100 years ago, before the federal government really started to pull away from the states the ability to naturalize people, after World War I, World War II, the federal government started to take over more, and they really created a backlog that we're seeing right now. But over 100 years ago, our district courts, if you came into a court, you had 2 years to say you wanted to be a citizen, you had 3 years, the judge would give you 3 years to learn the language, have a sponsor, have a job, and they would swear you in on the spot once you met all the requirements. That was great. Why can't we process people who want to become citizens faster? We are a nation of immigrants. We have tons of capacity in every state to bring more people in. So I think that instead of getting into bickering about the benefits or the negatives about immigration, we should just have a secure. I do think we need to have a secure border. I mean, you know, it's important to make sure that you have a sovereignty to your country and that you're not just letting everybody in without proof that they're either visiting or that they're a citizen. So I'd like to have security when people come into the country, but let's get them to become citizens faster. So I'd like to see. Working with federal partners, that means congressmen and senators, I'd like to work as governor to make sure that we expedite immigration faster. And any company right now that's hiring somebody who's illegal, in Massachusetts that's not punishable, but federally that's still a punishment. I'd like to have the punishment actually be that they hire the lawyer to make that person a citizen. And it's not a punishment. If they really feel that employee is a valuable contributing member of their company, let's let them help take that person take the next step and become that citizen. So I think there's some creative ways to try to make sure that those people who want to be here can be here, and we give them those opportunities. The American dream should be never out of reach for anybody, including those people who decide that they want to come to our country and enjoy the freedoms that they maybe don't have in their home countries.
Good. Geoff Diehl, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate it.
This Elect North Central Forum. The primary is when?
September 6th.
September 6th.
Oh, and go to geoffdiehl.com, GEOFFDIEHL.com to get involved and help with my campaign if you'd like. And if I'm successful after September 6th, it will be November 8th is the general election.
November 8th, and against the presumptive Democratic nominee. I think she's the only candidate left. Maura Healey is the only one left.
Unless there's a write-in.
So we'll have you both here for a debate, right?
We'll have to see about that.
Geoff Diehl, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us on the Elect North Central on our final gubernatorial forum. Bye-bye.